Welcome to episode number 100 of the Living While Loving Your Child Through Addiction podcast, formerly known as Living with Your Child's Addiction. Here, we focus on self care as we tend to our own lives while also extending love and compassion to our kids. This podcast offers science backed skills to bring hope and healing to your entire family. This is a huge milestone for me to reach 100 episodes. And in honor of that, I bought myself a new podcast microphone. And I love it, except for one thing. If I touch it in a certain place, the microphone mutes. And I just recorded this whole episode with a muted microphone because I accidentally touched it in that place. So I wish that I could turn that feature off. I guess fancy upgrade microphones aren't everything that that I thought they were. But this is such a huge milestone. I'm so excited because when I first started this podcast, I couldn't have imagined that I could come up with something to talk about for 100 episodes. But before I celebrate more, I want to let you know that I have enrollment open for an 8-week invitation to change group. I teamed up with another invitation to change certified facilitator to offer this group to 18 parents. We're keeping the group small because we want to be in a hands on, interactive group. We want there to be time for discussion and learning from other parents, and also time to focus on how to implement the skills that you learn. It's one thing to learn the skills, but it's another thing to figure out how you're going to implement those in your everyday life. Invitation to Change gave me the skills that I needed to become the expert that I'd been looking for to help me and my daughter. It was the first thing that gave me hope in 5 years of desperately searching for help. And whenever I do Invitation to Change groups, I love seeing that hope in other parents too, because Invitation to Change, it speaks to our hearts as parents because it has those compassionate aspects. But it also speaks to our heads because it's science backed and it educates us about addiction and teaches us the skills that we need. Many of the skills that I talk about on this podcast come from Invitation to Change. It's had a huge influence on me and how I coach. So, if you want to learn more about joining the group, there's going to be a link for it in the show notes. We are closing registration as soon as we reach 18 parents. So, don't wait because parents are already signing up. All right, back to celebrating 100 episodes. I want to take this moment to thank all the wonderful guests that I have had to help me reach 100 episodes, to help me support you as a listener. And I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank everybody who supports this podcast and shares it with other families that need it. I really feel honored and that it's a privilege that I get to do this work and support family recovery. And one of those guests that has been on the podcast twice that I would not be doing this work without is my daughter, Helena. And since this is such a big milestone episode, I wanted to take a minute to honor her before I get into today's topic. I got Helena's permission to do this work before I became a coach. And I want to thank her because it was very courageous and selfless of her to give me permission to freely share her story to help others. If she had said no to me, this podcast, none of the work, none of it would exist. I'd probably would have been a business coach or something. I don't know. But I wouldn't be doing this work. I would have respected her. So, as I was thinking about what I wanted to share about her on this episode to honor her, I thought about what happened recently when I was interviewed for a podcast. The show host asked me to describe Helena, which made me really happy because I talk about her all the time, but in the context of all the things that went wrong in our life and all the hard times that we had. But I don't get to really talk about who she was very often. And I noticed right away that I felt this loss for words and that I was really struggling to describe her. And the podcast is recording. My brain's going 90 miles an hour while I'm trying to figure out what to say about her. Trying to form the right words. And next thing you know, my excitement kind of changes to anxiety and I start getting this feeling of like a pit in my stomach. And as I was trying to figure out how to describe her, I ended up saying what was happening, that I thought maybe it was because I couldn't describe her the way we normally describe people. Like, I know the essence of my daughter, I know her soul, but not the normal things you describe people with, like her favorite color. I knew it used to be black and she was in the process of changing it. Maybe it was purple because she had purple toenails the last time I saw her. I'm unsure. I don't know what her favorite music was. She didn't have any hobbies. She didn't really care about brands of clothes or anything like that anymore. Like, when you're living in fight or flight and survival mode, or just early stages of recovery, just trying to get your life back on track, there are no favorites. You don't think about those things. So after the podcast was over and I had time to think about why I struggled with that so much without the pressure of a recording happening, I realized that the main reason that I struggled was because it feels as if there are no words. There are no words that can do her justice. That there is no way to describe what it felt like to be in her presence. There is no way to describe what it felt like when she would make me so mad and then turn around and make me laugh until my whole body was seizing up. Every muscle was tight, and I had to just get away from her so that I could catch my breath. And there's no way to describe the way her voice sounds in my ears or what it felt like to hug her tight. Words just fall short. The best way for you to get to know her truth is in one of the episodes where I interviewed her, episode number 41 and 44. And then in episode number 67, I shared the interview from number 41 again, but I added my thoughts and what I had learned since that interview. There was a lot of things that I viewed differently, and there were some stigmas that I still couldn't see at that time, and what I had learned since Helena had passed away. If I could ask Helena how she wanted to be honored, she would not talk about herself. She would talk about the bigger picture and the lessons that her and I both learned from the challenges of everything that we went through. The purpose of our life is to learn from our circumstances and to live our life and love deeper through those trials. We're only given one life, and that life can be cut short in an instant. One day, 21-year-old Helena was here, and the next day she was gone. She doesn't get another chance. But as long as we're here, we get another chance. Today, right now, we can decide to live our life in possibility rather than the probability of recreating our past in pain by staying the same. We get to open up to the gifts of those possibilities by learning from our circumstances rather than being in full resistance of them. Helena and I talked a lot about creating our own happiness in the months before she passed away. We can't let anger and grief and fear and sadness block the gift of life. I don't want to spend the next 20 years being sad and suffering when I can learn from everything that's happened. I have the opportunity to think intentionally about everything that's happened and how I respond to it. We all have that. That changes our experience of a circumstance. The circumstance doesn't have to change for our experience to change. The biggest blessing that I've received was realizing nobody was coming to rescue me from Helena's addiction. So, how am I going to rescue myself? The big thing was I stopped seeing it as her problem. It wasn't her problem. It was my problem because I was suffering. As long as it was her problem, I had no power to make anything better. And I wasn't able to connect with Helena no matter how hard I tried. But once it became my problem that I was struggling so much, I was able to start making positive change that then rippled out into her life as well. And a big part of that process of change was self awareness. And with self awareness came the realization that Helena and I were a lot more alike than I realized. In my judgments of what was happening with her, I started seeing her as very different from me. I created this hierarchy. But with self reflection and self awareness, I saw that there were only minor differences between us. The difference was that there was something naturally built into me that kept me from taking things too far. I had tendency to push the limits, but when I got too far, there was something in me that said, "No, Heather, you have to stop." And I was able to listen to that thing. But Helena didn't have that at all. Like when she was a little kid, the second that she could run up the cliff at the lake, she was jumping off of it. And she would run up and down, jumping off that cliff as many times as she could every time we were at the lake. That kid had no fear. But what I realized is I didn't have that built in thing in me that helped me to stop, that helped me to say no. I didn't have that because I was better than her. I was just different. And when I interviewed Helena for one of the podcast episodes she was on, I think it was the first one, 41, she pointed out how different our experience would have been if we could have focused on our similarities instead of our differences sooner. She was so insightful. I hear her words ringing in my ears all the time. Her trying to tell me that what I was doing was wrong and what she needed instead. So many instances where she said things like, I don't need a contract with my mom. I need my mom's love and support. She tried to tell me that she needed love 100 different ways, but I just didn't understand why I kept missing the mark. I was trying. I thought that I was doing the right things. I could not figure out why I was unable to convey love to her in the way that she needed it. I see it clearly now. I was able to get there, but I couldn't see the big picture at that time. I couldn't see past my fear, guilt, anger, and sadness to see what mattered most. And that was my love and connection with her. I just wasn't able to listen and learn until I started self reflecting. When I started learning about myself through my circumstances, I was able to stop making Helena responsible for my emotions in the condition of my life. Was her addiction a contributing factor to my life experience? Absolutely. Of course it was. But I had so much control over how I experienced that. I have this story, I think, that illustrates that really well. And the story might be hard to hear because I talk about self harm and it's a painful memory and experience. And I'm telling this with a lot of self compassion and not with blame, but with responsibility and awareness for what I've learned and what a huge impact it had on our circumstance when I was able to learn to respond to things intentionally. So I'm going to share this story with you as it happened and then tell you how I would have handled things differently today. So one night when Helena was around 16, she came home past curfew. She's high and she has a mason jar filled with pot. I only discovered the mason jar because, of course, the smell was filling the house and it was definitely stronger as I got closer to her bedroom. And at that time, I was married to her stepfather, and the smell of pot in the house just sent him over the edge. And we also had this, the way we were in our marriage, we did not have good communication. And he blamed me for her addiction. He always said that it's because I was too permissive and that Helena didn't respect me. And if she respected me, then she would stop using drugs. And I felt all of this pressure because that's this, kind of dialogue I'm having with myself. I'm doubting myself as a mom. I'm terrified about what's happening, this self destruction of an eating disorder, self harm, depression, anxiety, using all these different substances. And I'm feeling responsible for everything. He's just the external voice that's reinforcing all of my doubts that I already had. And that blaming dynamic between the three of us was so unhealthy, but none of us had the emotional intelligence or regulation or communication skills to deal with what was happening. So after she gets home, I'm totally dysregulated at this point and feeling confrontational, like in all this pressure. I've got to fix this. So I go in her room with this confrontational attitude because I needed to make her respect me, which I couldn't figure out to how to do because if you're a good mom, your child just automatically respects you, right? I search her room, I find the mason jar pot, take it across the hall to the bathroom, try to flush it down the toilet. She's trying to get it out of the toilet. We're pushing each other around, trying to control the situation. I end up finally flushing it all. She's irate. I'm irate. My husband's angry. Like, doors are slamming. And I go in my bedroom and try to calm down. But after a while, I start getting worried because Alana's likely to self harm in these situations. So I go to the bathroom and the door is locked. I persuade her to open it. And when I open the door, what I saw, I mean, I'll never be able to unsee. And she had cut herself so badly, she needed stitches. So again, I go into fear and panic because I don't understand this self harm thing at all. I'm saying, like, what are you doing? Why do you do this to yourself? What's wrong with you? And I start trying to talk her into going to the emergency room, but she doesn't want to go because she knows that they're probably going to put her in a behavioral health unit. And she knows that I'm probably going to try to push for that to happen. So she doesn't trust me. And she was right. That was my intent. And I had lied to try to get her to go to the emergency room with me. So she knows this is happening, but she gets in the car anyway. And the whole way there, she's struggling. She's threatening to jump out of the car. We get there. She won't get out and go in. She eventually starts running down the road. I start chasing her in the car. I call 911 and I'm pleading for the 911 operator to send a policeman and pleading with her to just stop and get back in the car. And next thing you know, not just one policeman shows up. There were several police cars, an ambulance, a fire truck. And I just remembered feeling so humiliated and embarrassed and defeated because my life was completely out of control. Like, how in the hell did we get here? I can't even tell you how many times I asked that question to myself over those 5 years. The police end up taking her to the emergency room. We're there for several hours, and they, of course, decide she needs to go to a behavior health unit. So I've been through this before. She's a minor. I have to go with her. And how they transport you to a behavior health unit. Well, we were going to this hospital that was like a waiting area where you wait for there to be a bed ready. And I don't know how they do it other places, but in Oklahoma, they handcuff you and put you in the back of a police car. And I had to follow the police car. Well, this time they told me that I couldn't go with her, which was shocking to me because I've been through this several times and I know how it works. But I go home, it's like 3 a.m. I sleep for about 5 hours and I wake up to all these missed calls. Well, they had put my phone number in the system wrong. Apparently, I was supposed to go to the hospital, and they left a message saying if I didn't get there, they were turning her over to DHS custody. So of course, run into action, get to the hospital, and find out that they had told Helena that I had abandoned her. And she got more agitated and was trying to break out of there. Finally, some smart nurse figured out asking Helena what my phone number was. So I managed not to get turned into DHS, and Helena and I spend the whole day and evening in this hospital locked waiting area for a bed to open up somewhere. And that period of time while we were waiting was actually okay. Helena was vulnerable enough to say to me that she was relieved that I didn't abandon her, which was a huge deal for her to say that to me at that time. And we were just in that calm after the storm period. We finally end up getting a bed in a behavior health unit about an hour and a half away. Again, they handcuff her. I follow the police car. And I go wait there with her through the whole process until they take her back to the locked area. And then I have to leave. And I felt these two very opposing emotions as I was leaving there. I felt some relief that I knew that she was okay and that I was going to get a little bit of a break. And I felt this emptiness leaving there without her. And I think it was probably like midnight or later again when I got home from there. So the next day, I wake up feeling like I've been hit by a Mack truck. We've gone through 2 days of this. I know that Helena's going to be mad at me when she gets out of there. And her stay there ended up being over a week. She really struggled the whole time she was there. She never just settled into it. And they finally end up calling me a week later and saying, if you I'm not there in 2 hours to pick her up, that I would have to pay $1,500. And I'm an hour and a half away from this place. But that's how it would work. Like no notice or anything. And I go pick her up. And of course, she's mad as a hornet because she's blaming me for all of this. And left there with her in the car feeling this immense anguish because I didn't know what to do. Like, I can't live like this anymore. Yet we ended up living like that for close to 2 more years. And things just kept getting worse because it took me that long to find craft, coaching, invitation to change, all of these skills that ended up turning things around for both of us. So I walked you through this whole story to help illustrate like the magnitude of the chaos that we lived in for years. But none of that had to happen that night. All of that could have been avoided. And it wouldn't have happened if I had done things differently. And I'm not saying that to blame myself because I didn't know how to do things differently at that time. But if I had known how to do things differently, that situation never would have happened. And I feel very confident saying that because when I changed my approach, when I learned these skills, those things stopped happening. The chaos in our life went from a 10 to an occasional, I just made up a new word, an occasional maximum of maybe a 3. But most of the time, there was tension, yes, discomfort, yes, sadness, all those things, but there was no more chaos and there was room for healing to happen. So I'm going to share with you 6 things in this situation. I'm sure there's more, but I'm just going to share 6 things that I had control of in that situation. I just didn't know how to identify that or what to do at the time. The number one thing is I would have never talked to her that night when she was high. I knew she was on Xanax, and that was not a good time to talk to her. Never went well. She would have just gone to sleep, and I could have handled it in the morning when I had a well rested brain and I was calm, and she would have been in a better place for the conversation. The number two thing I would have done differently is I wouldn't have thrown away the pot. I would have asked her to get it out of the house, but I wouldn't have gone through throwing it away. And my thought process for that is that it is not worth the withdrawal that I would have had to have made in our relationship account. So if you think of your relationship like a bank account and you are always either making deposits or withdrawals, deposits come from things like positive interactions, and they're really small. Withdrawals for things like throwing away pot and flushing it down the toilet, that's a huge withdrawal. And that was not worth emptying or getting overdrawn in our relationship account. I want to save those withdrawals for things I think will lead to positive change or health and wellness, like getting her to a doctor appointment. I don't want to use my withdrawals for punishment. The number three thing I would have done differently is I would have had a different attitude. Remember that I said that I went to confront her? When I waited until the next day to talk to her, I would have gone to the conversation with the word collaboration in mind instead of confrontation. That creates a completely different dynamic. If I go into a conversation to confront somebody, then I have a point to prove and I have a battle to win. But that means somebody has to lose. When I go into a conversation to collaborate, my goal is to find a solution that benefits everybody, to find common ground, to find understanding. But there was nothing beneficial about what happened that night. The story that I just told you about is the night I'm referring to. Number four, what I described about that dynamic that was going on between me and my husband, that was a reflection of both of us having a lack of communication skills, no or limited emotional intelligence, limited emotional regulation, and both of us being very triggered by how we had been affected by addiction in the past and all of the stigmas that we had associated with that. And a lot of times I hear people say that their marriage is being destroyed by addiction, but it became very clear to me that marriages aren't destroyed by addiction. They're destroyed by a lack of skills to handle such an intense situation. I've seen marriages do very well through their child's struggle with addiction. And they do so well because the parents come together to learn skills that they need as a family. So once I educated myself about the science of addiction and I gained that self awareness and I start trusting myself and listening to my inner guidance system and my values, I stopped being so influenced by others, including my now ex husband. It wasn't to do with Helena that we got divorced. I also changed how I was responding to him because of that. So I started realizing I didn't have to respond the way he expected me to with Helena. It was okay if we disagreed. It was okay if he was mad at me because I didn't do what he wanted me to do. I didn't have to try to convince him to be okay with it. I decided to just let him believe what he wanted to believe. He could think it was my fault. He could think that Helena disrespected me and that if she respected me, she would stop using substances. And I didn't have to try to convince him otherwise. Now, I took his feelings and what he said into consideration, but then I did what I thought was best for the unity of the whole family because I'm the one that has to live with the consequences of my actions, not him. And ironically, when I stopped doing things to keep him from getting angry and I stopped trying to convince him of my point of view, he started getting compassionate and he stopped making those demands. So there's this energetic magic that happens when you stop trying to convince others to see things the way that you want them to see them and just allow them to figure it out on their own. Number five thing I would have done different is how I handled self harm. When I learned that self harm is about emotional regulation, it's an attempt to regulate a dysregulated nervous system. It gives them relief. It the body releases these natural pain relieving chemicals and they help manage the physical pain, which can also help manage the emotional pain. Behaviors make sense. So when I started to understand self harm and had this different perspective, I stopped being so appalled by it. And appalled is the word I felt every time I thought about it. Now, knowing this doesn't mean that it felt good knowing that my daughter was self harming, but I didn't have this judgment about it anymore. I saw it and I saw her completely differently. Number six is respect is a two-way street. I would have handled my whole outlook on respect completely differently. I think the way I acted was actually pretty hypocritical because I was demanding respect from Helena and not treating her respectfully. I was operating from that do as I say, not as I do parenting playbook that I was raised with 50 years, over 50 years ago, where there's that parent child power dynamic and parents use fear to demand respect. But how could I expect my daughter to open up to me and tell me things that would result in punishment and judgment? Nobody's going to do that. They learn respect from us modeling it to them. And my values is not just as a mom, but as a person are that I want to remain respectful in an interaction, even if the other person I'm interacting with isn't being respectful. I can't control another person's respect of me, but I can respect myself by acting with integrity. And I wrote this down, but I don't remember where I saw it, so I'm sorry, but I can't give the author credit. But what I wrote down is that a respected child becomes a respectful child. Children are more likely to be influenced by family values if they feel valued within the family. I can tell you that when I became conscious of being respectful to Helena and treating her the way I would want to be treated, she started reflecting that back to me. Respect is contagious, just like a smile. So there's the six things I could have done that would have created a completely different outcome and avoided that situation. There's probably more things that I would have done differently, but those are six very concrete changes that you can think about and put to use in your own life. There still would have been anger and fear and frustration that night. There would have been all the emotions in the days to come, but I wouldn't have taken action from those emotions. I would have regulated myself first and taken intentional action from feelings like love and empathy and confidence and patience. My voice is starting to go because this is the second time I've recorded this episode and so I've been talking a lot. But I just want to reiterate that if I had been operating from a different mindset and a different set of skills, that story I just told you wouldn't have existed. There wouldn't have been confrontation, no cutting, no arguing, no ER, no calling 911, no behavior health unit, no feeling like the worst mom ever, no whole week of being stressed out of my mind while we were in absolute chaos between the hospitals and the behavior health unit. None of it if I had responded intentionally. And that runaway train, seemingly out of control story felt inevitable. Now I can't speak. It felt inevitable when I was in the middle of it. I felt 100% powerless. I was blaming Helena for what happened. Yet as I've shared with you, so much was within my power and control that night. All it took to shift that situation was some education, self-regulation, and communication skills. Those things would have come. Oh my gosh, I can't even get my words out. Those things would have created a completely different outcome. I think it's time to end this podcast episode. But I have years of stories like that one, and most of them could have been avoided. So I'd like to ask you to ask yourself how your interactions with your child would change if you were able to focus on what's within your control, if you were able to remain calm and collaborative and use positive communication. Okay, that's it for today. There's another episode coming out next week where my guest and I talk about overcoming overwhelm. I'll talk to you soon.